Shalom, good evening. This is TV7 Israel News, broadcast to you from Jerusalem. And in today's top stories, Jerusalem's top political and security brass pledges to persist the fight against Hamas until the Islamist terror group is decisively destroyed. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris highlights that the terror group Hamas is the one dragging its feet in negotiations to realize a temporary ceasefire in exchange for a hostage release outline. Egypt insists that the absence of a political process that could revitalize the Palestinian aspiration for statehood is the root cause to the lack of peace, security, and stability throughout the Middle East.
There's two paths. You can always be out to debunk stuff, and that's a very short path. Or you can be involved to understand things with greater detail, and that's an actual education. So when I'm pointing out these errors, it's to kind of demonstrate that when you take in the news, you're not supposed to accept everything as being true. You're supposed to listen to each statement, and where you're incredulous, where you're curious, where you are not satisfied with the evidence, that's where your education begins, and you begin looking things up. So if this war against the Palestinians in Gaza is going to continue until Hamas is gone, we've talked about this on the show, but that's going to be hard to do when their leadership is living it up in Qatar as billionaires. And according to this other article from CBC, there's no consequences. Like Israel has not gone there with hit teams. They haven't gone there with like Mossad, like they did. They hunted people down in the 70s after the Munich affair. Like they made movies about that. Nothing like that has gone on. Rather, it has been much easier to murder 30,000 civilians because they don't know how many of those civilians are actual Hamas brigade militants. And the other thing that became striking through that news clip was the fact that Israel has its military all well organized. But the goal of that military is to end the other side's ability to have a military. And it's not allowed to have a military in the first place. So it hasn't exactly been a fair game thus far. And as an objective spectator of the situation, it sure does seem a little unfair that, and that begs a
Well,
question.
it goes a
If
lot
you're in the right
deeper than
place, if,
right.
go ahead,
Sorry. Yeah,
for
this real
sure.
quick. I would just say their justification for decades has always been because of because they're surrounded by potentially hostile um nations. So they've used that, and especially in 1967, the preemptive strike, they made against Egypt, and then, the Six-Day War, and it was over very quickly. Um it was, that's unfortunately been the continual justification, and also part of, I think, where the mythology's been built up about the sophistication of that military. I would argue that potentially their intelligence is beyond sophisticated, based on Whitney Webb's research and others, where they keep, you see the
Mhm.
confluence of MI6 or British intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and American intelligence, which makes sense because there's an unholy sort of trinity there, as we've, presented on this show more than many times, the artifacts, historically speaking. Um, but yeah, that's so, like, unfortunately, that I think the Palestinian objective is one objective of a larger, but that's just speculation, but based on, of a larger possibility of them expanding territory even beyond their little nation state. Who knows? Or at least using the dialectical justification, sort of a Hegelian dialectic, if you will, of, using the need to continually build up their military, whether or not they're at war, whether Palestine exists or not, to combat with, Syria or Libya or Egypt, so forth, and Turkey, potentially all these various other nations.
Lebanon,
Lebanon,
Iran,
indeed. Iran,
Iraq.
yeah, Pakistan as well. Yeah.
So, a lot of people who are interested in this topic and are educated on this topic are educated on the Zionist side or they're educated on the Palestinian side. And very few people take the time and effort and intellectual aptitude it takes to like parse all the arguments on both sides and weigh them out. The process of thinking is learning how to adjudicate the facts of the matter. And if the facts and evidence don't align with the narrative, Should you keep the narrative, or should you probably try to understand what the facts and evidence actually have to relate? Like, where is the education? Is it in the assuming that these things are true, or is it in the inspection and learning about these things, these artifacts, these pieces of evidence that exist? So, in addressing this topic, this is not something that is usually talked about on either side very much, because this is August 2023. And so, if you want to understand what motivated a group of struggling people who have been incarcerated in Gaza in an open air prison camp, what makes them do these sort of things, I found this fact to be interesting. It made me a little incredulous. I said, no way that surely, with all this talk about, this is a righteous war because Hamas took prisoners that day, civilian prisoners. I thought, wow, that's a really convincing story. I agree with you. And then you learn a fact like this, and you have to say, wait a minute, it was very convenient that you left this fact out of your argument, because this would really outweigh on the other side in their favor for having an objective to balance it out. If you got 1,200 of their people being held as political prisoners, being detained without a trial or a judicial process, I mean, not that we don't have that here in this country to a degree at this point, but this is a relevant fact that is not usually weighed in the arguments. And people are so sure that they know the answers before they actually go and inspect the evidence.
Has anyone done a general grammar on who the Hamas leadership actually is? I'm curious. I mean, the fact that they're billionaires and the fact, I mean, are they somehow connected to Saudi money, maybe through a nod by Israel themselves? Obviously, we know Israel, set up and basically sponsored that party as a dialectical tool to be able to use as a justification for continual, incursions into Palestine, particularly military incursions, it should specify. Whereas in the West Bank, it's more settlement incursions. So two different strategies. One's a liberal, one's more of a right wing strategy at play at the same time in Israel, ironically speaking.
Well, we said when 10/7 happened, the first thing we mentioned was the history of CIA, MI6 working with the Muslim Brotherhood using proxy armies, those proxy armies having been groomed by fascist muftis, teachers that were students of a guy with a tiny mustache. So we put that all on the record. There is a militant fascist aspect to that, but that's overlaid onto the Palestinians in like 2006 when they voted Hamas in as their government, which was very convenient for the Likud
Correct.
Netanyahu group. And they supported it because it was a way to take away the secular aspects that Arafat had brought to the table before they whacked him with polonium, and to make it more Muslim extremist terrorism that could be equated with Hezbollah, ISIS, Al Qaeda, Mujahideen, Muslim Brotherhood,
Yeah,
all the
it's
above.
like a
Those are
rebranding.
flag words for Raytheon to make more missiles and bombs, right? Those are like the things that make those stocks go up when those words are in circulation. So
That's true.
to answer your question, I know that Hamas originally, back in the day, was founded by a medical doctor, and there might have been good intentions involved. But the leadership of today, like 40 years later, whatever, let's go
It
to the
says that
wiki.
they're sponsored
Let's
by
get
Israel itself. I mean,
well, it's going to be complicated and nuanced, as all these things tend to be.